What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. And if this is your first time here, welcome, my friend. So, how are you storing and accessing all the data collected in your Home Assistant instance? Well, you're in luck, because in today's video, I'm going to look at some best practices for handling all your data in Home Assistant if you're using a Raspberry Pi. Now, analytics is probably one of the hottest topics these days, but don't overlook the fact that it is the data that drives such analytics. And never underestimate the necessity for proper data management. To that fact, please ensure the protection of your data. It is vital that only those who should have access, and those who should not have access do not. As a result, you should use secure passwords for your Home Assistant users and, if possible, secure access in integrations that interface with your Home Assistant instance. But before I get too carried away, let's roll the intro. So let's start with the data storage alternatives available to us. Home Assistant can handle numerous devices, including the micro SD card, which I'm currently using in my instance, external storage mediums, for example, a USB attached SSD, or even an M.2 SATA drive with the right case. Even a hybrid design that combines the micro SD card and an external drive known as a data disk. The data disk holds not just user data, but also the majority of the Home Assistant software, such as the supervisor, as well as any add-ons and the logs. Because SD cards are notorious for failing, doing this with your instance will make the system much quicker and more dependable overall. So if we go into our settings and we scroll over to our system and our storage, I'm only using this is a kind of a fresh install. A few things are installed on it. Our system health. So we can see that I'm using a 64 gigabyte SD card or micro SD card. So now let's take a quick look at some of the drawbacks or issues you can encounter while using a USB 3.0 storage device with Home Assistant. You might run into interference issues with other USB devices like a Zigbee or Z-Wave if you have those plugged into your USB, as well as Bluetooth troubles on the Pi itself. So the best approach is to use a longer USB 3 cable adapter to move the device further away from the Pi, and to even use USB 3 extension cables on your other Zigbee or Z-Wave devices just to get everything as far away from each other as possible. You can get around a lot of these issues with the USB storage device if you plug it into one of the USB 2 ports, but then you're not going to benefit from the faster speeds offered by USB 3, which will have the opposite effect of speeding up the system, and it may even cause complications with your database entries or camera feeds. Also, you may run into some power issues depending on the type of device you are using and might have to use a USB 3 powered hub, which will supply the power needed to the device instead of the Pi. And actually, that is what I am using for my setup, is a powered USB hub. So I'm providing external power to the Raspberry Pi. Okay, great. So we've covered the storage options, but where is everything stored? Well, Home Assistant's default database for storing events and history is SQLite, and the database file is located in your config directory. But we're in luck as Home Assistant uses SQL Alchemy, so several different databases can be utilized and are implemented using the recorder component in your configuration.yaml file. As I previously stated, if you solely use an SD card, like I'm using in this instance, these devices can only perform so many read-write operations before they may fail. As a result, using an SD card for your production instance is not recommended, and often the biggest mistake made by new users, which is totally understandable as your experience with the software isn't there yet. So my suggestion would be to use the hybrid option, if not the full-fledged SSD or NVMe/M.2 SATA boot options. As for my recommendation for a database, if you haven't guessed, I prefer open source, which together with my love and experience with the Django and Python leads me to PostgreSQL. Now, to be able to utilize this with Home Assistant, however, it does require you either have a server or a VM running a server, or if you're running this in Docker, then you can run a Docker container, which in turn will run PostgreSQL. And if that isn't an option for you, my second choice would be to use the InfluxDB integration or MariaDB integration in Home Assistant itself. Just to show you right now, if we go into add-ons, we can see that I already have MariaDB running, and that is because I'm using the Nginx proxy manager. So in order to install MariaDB, you would just find it in the add-on store down here, search for it, and when you click on it, you will see instead of this saying stop and restart, it'll say install. So just go ahead and install it. Once it has installed, then you can check the configuration to see the different logins and rights. And then once you have that set up, then you can just hit start. Now, these logins and passwords are going to be for your MariaDB, and everything is explained here in the documentation tab. And once you do hit start, you can check the logs to make sure that everything is running. And sometimes what you have to do is just hit this refresh, and that will refresh and bring you the latest log entries. So as I was mentioning, if we just go back to the integrations and we click on the add-on store, we can see that there's InfluxDB that can also be used. And as I was mentioning, here is that install button if you're installing InfluxDB. And the documentation is here on the documentation. And you just go through there to have InfluxDB up and running. Choice is yours whether you want to use Postgres or MariaDB or Influx. I'm using MariaDB in this case because I'm running the Nginx proxy manager. All right, so we have MariaDB installed, but in order to use it, we are going to have to go into our configuration and make a change in there. And that is going to be to the recorder. So we want to actually tell it to use the MariaDB. So if we go back to the add-on for MariaDB, in the documentation, it tells you, it gives you an example configuration. And this is going to be the username for your database and the password for the database, and then the database itself. So we have to add this entry into our configuration.yaml. So in order to get there, I'm using Visual Studio Code. So we just load up Visual Studio Code, and then in our configuration, here's the entry here. Once you put this entry in, just hit Control S to save. And then going down to Developer Tools, do check configuration to make sure the configuration is valid, and then restart. And once it boots back up, it will start using the MariaDB database. And you will notice, especially if your system is older, that it's going to boot faster. It's going to load logs faster. It's going to load the history faster. Okay. So if you're going to be starting from scratch and you wish to boot from SSD or another USB mass storage device, just make sure your EEPROM version is at least 2020-12-11 on your Raspberry Pi or higher. And if you don't know how to update that EEPROM version, I have done a video in the past on how to update your EEPROM, and it'll be linked up in the corner right now. Also, due to the complexity of the range of USB storage devices, not all these devices will operate with Home Assistant. So a general rule is that if a device works with Raspberry Pi OS, it should work with Home Assistant. However, because U-boot is utilized in the boot chain with Home Assistant, some devices known to operate with Raspberry Pi OS won't work with Home Assistant. So unfortunately, finding a USB drive that works successfully with Home Assistant can require some trial and error. However, there are numerous blog posts or Home Assistant forums that mention which stored devices users have had success with. Plus, I've linked to the one I'm using below. And finally, if you're doing a new install on an SD card and then migrating it to the hybrid option, all you have to do is flash your SD card and then follow the migrating to USB data disk procedure, which I'm going to demonstrate in a moment. Before you wipe out your present setup, you're going to take a full snapshot or backup of your instance. So in order to do that, we just come down to Settings, and then we go into System, and then from there we go into Backups. And what we would do is we would create a backup, and we would give that backup a name, and we're going to be doing a full backup and then hitting Create. You can use password protection for your file, but you are going to have to remember that password in order to be able to access it. So let's just do a backup here. Just call it new. It's a full backup, and I'm going to hit Create. So like I said, this is fairly fresh install, so my backup isn't very big. The next thing you're going to do before you wipe out your system is you're going to click on this backup that you just made, and then with the 3 dots, you're going to go download backup. And that's going to download to the system computer that you are accessing Home Assistant with. We'll just close that. And now we have our backup safe in hand. So let's talk about migrating to a USB data disk, the hybrid option. So I'm going to be using a Kingston 240 gigabyte SSD, which I will have linked in the video description, as well as a cable to have it moved away from the Pi. So I'm going to go ahead and plug this in to my Raspberry Pi now. And if you're going to be using this hybrid model, which is a combination of the SD card and the USB mass storage device, first make sure you've backed up the contents of the USB mass storage device you're going to be using, because this operation is going to format and wipe the drive clean. And secondly, the storage capacity of the USB storage device must be larger than the storage capacity of your existing SD card. So my SD card is 64 gigabyte, and the USB storage device I'm going to be using is 240 gigabyte, so it is bigger. Now, when you're ready to proceed, connect the drive to the Raspberry Pi. And then in order to make this migration, we're going to just navigate over to Settings, and then we're going to go on System. And then from here, we are going to go into Storage, and the 3 dots at the top here, we're going to move data disk. So now that we have this window that pops up, we can see that it can see the data disk that I installed. So I will click it and then just hit move. So now it is migrating everything over to the data disk. This is going to take some time, so I will come back to you as soon as this completes. Okay, welcome back. As you can see, it has moved the data disk, and our use space went from 8.5%, I believe it was, or 8%, and we're only using 1.9% now of the 220 gigabytes. And I know I did mention it, but just keep in mind, this process does take some time. So I do suggest going and doing something else while this is running. Why not make your partner happy? Maybe go do the dishes, some laundry, clean the house. I don't know, do something and just let it do its thing. And when you come back, it'll be all done. Okay, so now let's see, we want to migrate completely over to an SSD, and we don't want the hybrid option. We want to remove our micro SD card from the Raspberry Pi. In order to do that, we are going to need that backup that we took, and we're going to do a fresh install to the SSD. I will use Imager to image the SSD. The process has changed a little bit. Before, you were able to load your image directly from the install wizard that comes up after Home Assistant boots up. However, now you have to enter in a few details, and once your details are entered in, then you can go and restore your backup. So we're going to see that process here now. Okay, so here I'm going to demonstrate a fresh install, and this happens to be a direct SSD boot, so no SD card is needed. When the Pi first loads up, you'll see the preparing Home Assistant. It can take up to 20 minutes. Typically, I see it normally take about 5 minutes. So as soon as we get to the login screen, I will bring the video back. I will mention, if you are sitting here waiting for it, you can use your mouse here and just kind of play around and just hovering it over these nodes. It interacts with it. Not sure if anyone knows that, but there you go. Have fun. Okay, so the first step is we're going to create our account. And for the analytics here, I always just give them all the information. It is anonymous, and it's a nice way to support the team. All right, so here we are. We have nothing installed. Looks like they made a couple of changes. But if we go into System and then Backups, we can upload the backup that we downloaded. And then select what we want. And I'm going to do a full backup restore. And depending on the size of your instance, this can take quite a bit of time. Even at 0.9 megabytes, it takes me approximately 10 minutes for this backup to happen. So I will let it do its restore, and then we will see that we have completely migrated over to an SSD boot. All right, so that has finished. And now you see how easy it is to switch from your micro SD card to a full USB SSD boot. That backup loaded, and now as we can see, everything that we had before is still in here. Perfect. So today we concentrated on data management in this tutorial. And while it may be tempting to disregard these minor changes, now you know that they can have a compounding effect on decreasing the performance of your Pi over time and even jeopardizing your data. I hope I've given you the tools and knowledge to construct and maintain the integrity of your system in order to keep your data safe and your system working at peak performance. But my friends, this is where I'm going to leave you in this video. If you've made it this far, you're awesome. I really appreciate that. And I'd love to hear from you in the comment section below. Also, I hope to see you in future videos. Goodbye.